The heavy iron doors groaned open, their rusty hinges protesting against the cold morning air. Gabriel stepped forward, feeling the weight of 5 years of captivity lift, just slightly, as the first breath of freedom filled his lungs. The world outside hadn't changed much, but he had. His body had endured the confinement, but his mind, that was a different story. Every sleepless night, every minute spent staring at the ceiling of his cell, had been consumed by one thing: Helena. She had been his light, his reason for surviving, and yet she was gone, stolen from him in a cruel twist of fate. He clenched his fists, pushing down the bitter memories. There was no time to dwell on grief. He had a promise to keep. His feet moved instinctively, carrying him toward the only place that mattered now: the cemetery. As he walked down the empty street, the world felt eerily silent. The faint drizzle kissed his skin, and the scent of damp earth mixed with distant car fumes. His reflection in a store window caught his attention. Unshaven, leaner, and with eyes that had seen too much. He barely recognized himself, but none of that mattered. All that mattered was her. Minutes later, he stood before the wrought iron gates of the cemetery. His breath hitched. The path ahead seemed endless, lined with gravestones that whispered forgotten names. But he wasn't here for just anyone. He was here for her. As he stepped forward, each footfall echoed like a drumbeat in his chest. And then he saw it, the name, the dates, and his entire world shifted. Gabriel froze. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the soft patter of rain. He wiped his sleeve across his face, as if clearing his vision would change what he was seeing. But no, the inscription on the tombstone remained the same. Helena Vasconcelos, 1993-2017. His fingers traced the cold granite, his mind desperately trying to make sense of it. This wasn't right. It couldn't be right. He had been convicted in 2018. The accident that supposedly took her life had happened mere weeks before his arrest. But according to the dates carved into this stone, she had been dead for months before the crash. His breath caught in his throat. What the hell was going on? Panic surged through him, a tangled mess of confusion and grief. He took a shaky step back, scanning the cemetery as if expecting someone to jump out and explain this twisted joke. But there was no one. Only the endless rows of graves and the cold wind slicing through his jacket. He needed answers. Now, heart pounding, he turned on his heel and strode toward the cemetery office. An old man sat behind the desk, adjusting his thick glasses as he sifted through yellowed papers. Gabriel's voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "Helena Vasconcelos. Where is she buried?" The old man looked up, brows knitting together. "Helena Vasconcelos." He repeated the name slowly, as if tasting the syllables. "Son, are you sure you got the right place?" Gabriel clenched his jaw. "I just saw her grave, right there, but the dates don't add up. Can you check the records?" The old man sighed, flipping through a massive logbook. His bony fingers stopped on a page, eyes narrowing behind his thick lenses. Then he looked up, shaking his head. "There's no one by that name buried here." Gabriel's stomach dropped. "What?" The old man shut the book with a soft thud. "I've been working here for 20 years, son, and I can tell you, Helena Vasconcelos was never laid to rest in this cemetery." Gabriel felt the air grow heavier around him, his chest tightening as if the walls of the small cemetery office were closing in. His mind raced, trying to grasp the meaning of what the old man had just said. No one by that name buried here? That was impossible. He had seen the grave, had touched the stone with his own hands. He swallowed hard, pushing back the burning frustration rising in his throat. "That can't be right," he muttered, his voice lower now, more to himself than to the old man. "I saw it. Her name was right there, carved in stone. Are you telling me I imagined it?" The old man adjusted his glasses and exhaled deeply, as if dealing with yet another lost soul, looking for something that wasn't there. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the wooden desk that smelled of dust and damp paper. "Son, I don't know what to tell you," he said, his tone softer now, almost apologetic. "I've managed these records for 2 decades. Every name, every date, every detail. If she were here, I'd know. But there's no Helena Vasconcelos in this cemetery. Not now, not ever." He slid the heavy logbook toward Gabriel, tapping a wrinkled finger on the page. "See for yourself." Gabriel's fingers trembled as he scanned the page. The book was old, the ink slightly faded, but the names and dates were clear. He flipped through the past few years, searching desperately for any mention of Helena. Nothing. No Vasconcelos, no Helena. It was as if she had never existed, at least not in death. His head pounded with the weight of a question too big to ignore. If she wasn't buried here, then where was she? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He pushed the book away, his breath unsteady, his eyes locked onto the old man's, searching for something, anything that might make sense of this. Could it be a mistake, a record lost? Maybe someone moved the body? The words tasted wrong, even as he said them. Bodies didn't just vanish. Graves didn't rewrite themselves. Yet here he was, staring at the evidence, or rather the absence of it. The old man sighed again, rubbing his temples. "I don't know what to tell you, son. But if I were you, I'd start asking different questions. Maybe she ain't where you think she is. Maybe she never was." Gabriel stumbled out of the cemetery office, the rain now heavier, soaking into his thin jacket. The wind cut against his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind was too consumed by the impossibility of what had just happened. He turned back toward the grave. No, the place where the grave should be, but his feet refused to move. The realization that he had spent the last 5 years mourning someone who might not even be dead was beginning to suffocate him. He needed answers, and there was only one person left in this world who might help him find them. Daniel, his best friend, the only person who had ever believed in him, even when the rest of the world had turned its back. If anyone could help him unravel this nightmare, it was Daniel. But the thought of going back to that place, to the police station, made Gabriel's stomach twist. Memories of his trial came flooding back, the accusing stares, the whispered conversations in the hallways, the sound of the gavel sealing his fate. He had spent years replaying that moment, the moment they took everything from him. And now he had to walk back through those same doors and ask for help, his fists clenched at his sides. No, this wasn't about pride, it wasn't about the past, it was about Helena. He forced himself to move, his steps quickening as he made his way through the wet, empty streets. The city looked different than he remembered, though maybe it was he who had changed. The buildings seemed taller, the lights harsher, the people more distant. He passed by a cafe they used to go to, where Helena would always order the same cinnamon latte. The memory hit him like a punch to the gut, a reminder of everything he had lost. But maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost her at all. By the time he reached the police station, his hands were numb from the cold, his heart hammering so hard it hurt. He hesitated just outside the glass doors, watching the officers inside moving in their routine. 5 years ago, these people had put him away, convinced of his guilt. He wondered how many of them still thought of him as a criminal. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The warmth of the station was a stark contrast to the storm outside, but it did little to ease the chill in his bones. Then he spotted Daniel, and for the first time in years, hope flickered in his chest. Daniel was hunched over his desk, flipping through case files, oblivious to the world around him. The years had been kinder to him, his uniform still crisp, his expression focused, his life uninterrupted by the kind of destruction Gabriel had endured. Gabriel swallowed hard, suddenly feeling the weight of his own reality pressing down on him. How many times had he imagined this moment? How many times had he thought about confronting his best friend, demanding to know why he hadn't done more? But this wasn't the time for blame. He needed answers. Steeling himself, Gabriel walked forward, his boots heavy against the tiled floor. It wasn't until he was standing right in front of the desk that Daniel looked up. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to pause. Surprise flickered across Daniel's face, quickly replaced by something heavier, concern. "Gabriel?" His voice was cautious, as if unsure whether he was seeing a ghost. "What are you doing here?" Gabriel didn't waste time. He sat down, resting his arms on the desk, his voice low but firm. "I need your help." He explained everything, every disturbing detail. The grave that shouldn't exist, the name that wasn't in the records, the impossible dates, the realization that Helena's death might have been a lie. Daniel listened in silence, his face unreadable, his fingers interlocked on the desk. When Gabriel finished, the room seemed colder, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above them. Then, without a word, Daniel turned to his computer. He typed quickly, his eyes scanning the screen, searching. Gabriel held his breath, every second stretching unbearably. And then, Daniel froze, his brows furrowed, his jaw tightening. He clicked on something, his eyes darting across the information in front of him. "That accident, the one that supposedly killed Helena," Daniel murmured, his voice almost too low to hear. "There's another name in the report, a different name." Gabriel leaned in, his pulse skyrocketing. "What do you mean?" Daniel's eyes met his. "The body found in the wreckage. It wasn't Helena Vasconcelos." He turned the screen toward Gabriel, pointing at a single line in the report. "It was a woman named Marina Costa." Silence crashed over them like a tidal wave. Gabriel's world tilted, the truth hanging in the air between them. He stared at the screen, his mind struggling to catch up. If Helena wasn't the one who died that night, then where the hell was she? Gabriel's breathing grew shallow, his mind racing to keep up with what he was seeing. Marina Costa. That name meant nothing to him. It was supposed to be Helena in that car. That was the story everyone had believed. The story K.O. Condenu. And yet here it was, buried in the official records. A truth that no one had questioned. He felt his stomach churn, a mix of rage and confusion. "This has to be a mistake," he said, his voice hoarse. "They told me Helena was in that wreckage. They told me..." His throat tightened. They had told him so many things. Now, he wasn't sure if any of them were true. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Gabriel, listen. I don't know what this means yet, but something isn't right." His eyes flickered between Gabriel and the screen, as if debating whether to say what was really on his mind. "This accident, it was closed fast, too fast. I remember when it happened, I was still a rookie. There was barely an investigation, no autopsy reports made public, no follow-ups. Just a quick conclusion and a sealed file." He looked up, his expression grim. Like someone wanted to bury this before anyone could ask questions. A chill ran down Gabriel's spine. He had spent years believing in a lie, locked away while the world moved on without him. But now, for the first time, he had proof, actual, undeniable proof, that Helena's death had been staged, that the truth had been twisted. And if someone had gone to this length to cover it up, then it could only mean one thing. She was still alive. The thought sent a jolt through his body, electrifying every nerve. He leaned in, gripping the edge of the desk. "Then we find out who buried it." His voice was steady, but the fire in his eyes said everything. "And we find out why." Daniel hesitated, glancing around the station before lowering his voice. "Gabriel, if this goes as deep as it looks, we're not just digging up an old case. We're going to war with someone powerful. People don't fake deaths for nothing. They do it because the truth is more dangerous than the lie." He leaned forward, his tone firm. "Are you sure you're ready for what we might find?" Gabriel didn't even blink. He had lost too much already. He had spent 5 years in a cage, mourning a woman who might still be breathing. If there was even the smallest chance of finding her, of understanding why she disappeared, he wasn't going to stop now. His fingers curled into a fist on the desk. "I don't care how deep this goes," he said, his voice cold and certain. "I need to know the truth." The rain had stopped, but the cold lingered in the air, biting through Gabriel's clothes as he left the police station. The city stretched before him, familiar yet distant, like a photograph of a place he once knew. His thoughts churned in a relentless storm. Helena, Marina Costa, the grave that never existed. Every new piece of information felt like a thread, unraveling a fabric he hadn't even realized was stitched together. He had spent years believing in one version of reality, only to discover that it had been carefully manufactured. But why? And by whom? His first instinct was to go back to the cemetery, to stare at that gravestone until it gave him the answers he needed. But that was useless now. What he needed wasn't buried 6 feet under. It was out there, hidden behind walls of deception. His fingers twitched as he pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolling through his contacts. Most of them were ghosts of his past, numbers that had long since stopped answering his calls. But one name still meant something: Elias. The old driver had worked for the Vasconcelos family for years. He had been there when Gabriel and Helena had first met, when their love was young and reckless. And if there was anyone left who might know something, anything, it was him. Gabriel hesitated for only a moment before pressing dial. The phone rang 3 times before a voice, cautious and worn with age, answered. "Who is this?" Gabriel took a breath. "It's me, Elias. I need to see you." Silence. Then a slow exhale. "Gabriel, you shouldn't have called." The words sent a sharp pulse through his chest. Whatever Elias knew, it was something worth hiding. Gabriel's grip tightened around the phone. "Then that means I really need to hear it." Gabriel sat in the back of an old cafe, his fingers wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. The dim lighting barely reached the corners of the place, and the faint sound of jazz crackled from a radio behind the counter. He had arrived early, too early, but waiting was better than sitting alone with his thoughts. His heart pounded in anticipation, his mind replaying every memory tied to Helena, Elias, and the Vasconcelos family. What did Elias mean when he said, "I shouldn't have called"? The weight of those words gnawed at him, pressing against his ribs like a vice. The door creaked open, and Gabriel recognized the silhouette immediately. Elias had aged, his hair thinner, his back slightly hunched, but his eyes were still sharp, still filled with the same cautious wisdom that had always set him apart from the other employees of the Vasconcelos estate. He scanned the cafe with the wary eyes of a man who had spent his life watching his back. Then, with a slow, calculated step, he made his way to Gabriel's table and sat down. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. Elias let out a tired sigh, rubbing his weathered hands together. "I shouldn't be here," he muttered, barely above a whisper. "If they knew I was talking to you, I don't even want to think about what would happen." His voice carried the weight of years spent carrying secrets, of knowing too much, but being powerless to change anything. He looked up, meeting Gabriel's gaze for the first time. "You were supposed to forget, son. You were supposed to move on." Gabriel leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "Forget? They took my life from me, Elias. They locked me up, made me believe Helena was dead. And now I find out that everything I thought I knew was a lie." His voice trembled with a mix of anger and desperation. "Tell me where she is. Tell me what happened to her." His fingers dug into the table, his body tense with the need for answers. Elias hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to be listening. Then, in a voice so low Gabriel had to strain to hear it, he said, "She's alive, Gabriel, but finding her won't be easy." Gabriel's hands clenched into fists as Elias's words settled into his mind like a slow-burning fire. "She's alive." He had dreamed of hearing those words, had imagined 1,000 different scenarios in which Helena had somehow survived. But none had prepared him for this moment. His pulse roared in his ears, his entire body thrumming with adrenaline. He leaned in, his voice sharp with urgency. "Then tell me where she is, now." His demand was met with a deep sigh from Elias, a sigh that carried the weight of a man who had seen too much and had spent years burying what he knew. Elias shook his head, his fingers tapping against the table in an anxious rhythm. "You don't understand, Gabriel," he murmured, his voice laced with something close to fear. "This isn't just about finding her. This isn't about you marching up to wherever she is and taking her home. There are people involved in this. Powerful people. People who don't forgive mistakes and don't leave loose ends." He rubbed his temples, exhaling deeply before continuing. "The night do acidente não foi acidente. E o corpo naquela ambulância não era o dela." His gaze lifted, meeting Gabriel's stunned expression. "Tudo foi armado, desde o começo." Gabriel felt the air leave his lungs as if he had been punched in the gut. He had suspected as much, had known deep down that something was wrong, but hearing it aloud made it real in a way that shattered every last bit of composure he had left. His hands shook as he ran them through his hair, struggling to piece together what this revelation meant. "Then why?" he asked, his voice cracking under the weight of the question. "Why would they do this? Why fake her death? Why let me rot in prison por 5 anos, Elias?" His voice rose, earning a few glances from nearby tables, but he didn't care. He needed answers. Elias hesitated, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He looked at Gabriel, as if weighing whether to tell him the full truth or let him walk away before it was too late. But the look in Gabriel's eyes, the desperation, the rage, the heartbreak, made the decision for him. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to just above a whisper. "Because, Gabriel, she was carrying your child, and Rogerio Vasconcelos would rather burn the world to the ground than let his grandson be raised by you." The words hit like a sledgehammer, shaking Gabriel to his core. A child, his child. Helena hadn't just been taken from him. His entire future had been stolen. Gabriel felt as if the ground had cracked open beneath him, pulling him into a void of disbelief and fury. A child. His child. The revelation struck like a thunderbolt, unraveling 5 years of suffering and unanswered questions in a single breath. His fingers dug into the worn-out wood of the cafe table, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to speak, to demand more details, but his throat had tightened, as if his body itself refused to process the truth. A child. One he never knew existed. One that had been hidden from him just as Helena had. His voice, when it finally came, was nothing more than a whisper. "Where is she? Where's my child?" Elias inhaled sharply, his gaze shifting toward the cafe window, scanning the streets as though expecting someone to be watching. His paranoia was palpable, a living thing coiling around them both. "They're being watched, Gabriel," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. "Helena, the kid, they've been kept under lock and key ever since that night. Rogerio made sure of it. She was forced to disappear, to take on another identity. And you were the perfect scapegoat, the perfect way to keep her quiet. They knew you'd never stop looking for her, so they made sure you couldn't." His jaw tightened, his hands clasped together as if trying to hold in the weight of the truth. "You were never meant to get out." The word sent a chill through Gabriel's spine, a cold, creeping sensation that settled deep in his bones. His imprisonment hadn't just been an unfortunate consequence of a crime he didn't commit. It had been intentional, a calculated move to erase him from Helena's life. The realization fueled a fire inside him, a rage that burned hotter with every second. He had spent 5 years in a cage, mourning a woman who was very much alive, oblivious to the fact that somewhere out there, his own flesh and blood was growing up without him. His hands trembled, but this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from the storm brewing inside him. "I need to find them," he said, his voice steady despite the fury raging within. "I need to bring them back." Elias hesitated, rubbing his temples as if battling with the consequences of what he was about to say. "I can help you," he finally muttered, meeting Gabriel's gaze with something close to resignation. "But once you start down this road, there's no turning back. Rogerio Vasconcelos doesn't lose. If you go after them, you won't just be fighting for your family, you'll be fighting for your life." His eyes darkened, his voice turning grave. "Are you really ready for that?" Gabriel didn't even hesitate. He had lost everything already. His freedom, his reputation, the love of his life. And now he knew he had lost a child too. There was no fear left in him, no hesitation, no second guessing. There was only one truth that mattered. "I don't care what it takes," he said, his voice low but unshakable. "I'm getting them back." Elias sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as if bracing himself for what was to come. His eyes darted toward the cafe window again, scanning the streets with a quiet paranoia that made Gabriel's stomach twist. This wasn't just fear. This was the exhaustion of a man who had been looking over his shoulder for years. Finally, Elias leaned in, lowering his voice to barely a whisper. "If you really want to do this, we have to move carefully. Rogerio's reach is deeper than you can imagine. He doesn't just watch people, Gabriel. He owns them." His fingers tapped anxiously against the table. "If he finds out you're looking for Helena and the kid, he won't just try to stop you. He'll erase you. For good." Gabriel's jaw clenched, his muscles tensing with barely contained rage. He had already lost 5 years of his life to the Vasconcelos family's lies. What was left for Rogerio to take? He had nothing to lose. No job, no home, no future. The only thing keeping him standing was the burning need to find his family. "Let him try," Gabriel said, his voice low and unwavering. "I spent half a decade locked away, thinking Helena was dead. I've already lived through hell, Elias. There's nothing he can do to me that I haven't already survived." His eyes burned with a quiet, terrifying resolve. "Now tell me what I need to do." Elias hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his coat. His next words carried a weight that Gabriel hadn't fully considered. "You need to disappear," Elias said, his voice firm. "The second Rogerio hears you're out, he'll have eyes on you. If you start poking around, asking questions, it won't take long for them to come after you. And if they find you before you find her..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. Gabriel exhaled, running a hand over his face, frustration gnawing at him. He had just gotten his life back. Now he had to vanish again. It felt cruel, unfair. But fairness didn't exist in a world controlled by men like Rogerio Vasconcelos. Gabriel leaned back, staring at the cracks in the cafe's ceiling as his mind churned. "Then I'll do whatever it takes," he muttered, more to himself than to Elias. He wasn't afraid of running. He wasn't afraid of hiding. But what haunted him, what made his stomach twist into knots, was the idea that Helena might not want to be found, that maybe, after all these years, she had given up on him. He swallowed hard, shoving the thought away. "Where do we start?" he asked, grounding himself in the only thing that mattered now: action. Elias studied him for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of hesitation, any reason to tell him to walk away. But when he found none, he finally spoke. "There's someone who might know where she is," he said, his voice almost reluctant. "But it's gonna cost you." Gabriel's eyes narrowed. He had no money, no resources. But if that was the price for the truth, then he would pay it, one way or another. "Tell me where to find them," he said, his tone deadly serious. Elias nodded slowly, exhaling through his nose. "Meet me tomorrow night. Same place. I'll make the call." He stood up, throwing a few crumpled bills on the table before turning toward the door. But just as he reached for the handle, he stopped, looking over his shoulder. "Gabriel, be careful," he warned, his voice laced with something that almost sounded like regret. "You have no idea what you're walking into." And with that, he was gone, leaving Gabriel alone with the storm of his own thoughts. The night air was thick with humidity, clinging to Gabriel's skin as he walked through the dimly lit streets. The city felt different now, less familiar, more dangerous. Every passing car, every shadow stretching beneath the flickering streetlights, felt like a pair of eyes watching him. He wasn't being paranoid. Elias had made it clear. Rogerio Vasconcelos had power, and power meant control. Gabriel was no longer just an ex-convict trying to piece his life back together. He was a threat, a man looking for answers that weren't meant to be found, and that made him a target. He pulled his hood up as he turned the corner, his breath steady despite the storm raging inside him. Elias had promised answers, but at a cost. Gabriel had no money, no influence, nothing of material value to offer. But he knew, deep in his gut, that whoever Elias was taking him to see wouldn't be interested in cash. Information, loyalty, blood. That was the currency of people who dealt in secrets. He clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. He was ready to pay the price, whatever it was. He had to be. The meeting spot was an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city, its rusted metal walls covered in graffiti, the shattered windows dark and empty. Gabriel hesitated at the entrance, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But then he thought of Helena, of the child he had never met. And just like that, the fear evaporated. He stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of oil and damp concrete. A single hanging light flickered above, casting eerie shadows against the walls. Elias was already there, standing near a makeshift table where an older man sat, his face partially obscured by cigarette smoke. He was thin, his skin weathered by time and hardship, but his sharp eyes gleamed with something dangerous. He didn't look up as Gabriel approached, instead taking a slow drag from his cigarette. When he finally exhaled, the smoke curled between them like a silent warning. "So this is the man looking for ghosts," the stranger muttered, his voice rough like sandpaper. "You must be desperate." Gabriel's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I just want the truth," he said evenly. The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Truth," he repeated, amused. "That's always the most expensive thing, isn't it?" Gabriel's muscles tensed as the stranger leaned back in his chair, tapping the ash of his cigarette onto the dusty concrete floor. The man's gaze lingered on him, studying him like a hunter sizing up wounded prey. There was no kindness in his eyes, no hint of sympathy, only calculation. "Truth," the man repeated, rolling the word on his tongue as if it were something foreign. "Everyone wants it, but no one ever stops to think about what it costs." He exhaled a slow stream of smoke, his lips curling into something that almost resembled a smile. "So tell me, Gabriel, what exactly are you willing to sacrifice?" Gabriel's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He had already lost everything: his freedom, his reputation, 5 years of his life. There was nothing left for him to give except his own damn soul. His voice was steady, firm. "Whatever it takes," he said. "I need to know where Helena is. I need to know where my child is." The man tilted his head slightly, as if amused by his determination. He tapped his cigarette against the table, then finally sat up, his expression turning unreadable. "Elias says you're serious," he mused, "that you won't run when things get ugly, and they will get ugly, Gabriel." He paused, letting the words sink in before adding, "So here's my offer. One chance, one piece of information. But in return, you do something for me." Gabriel's stomach twisted. He had expected this. Nothing in this world came for free. But what unsettled him was the way the man was watching him, as if he already knew Gabriel's answer. He swallowed hard, his voice measured. "What do you want?" The man smirked, flicking his cigarette away. "A simple favor," he said, though the glint in his eyes suggested otherwise. "There's someone who owes me a debt. A man who's been hiding under Rogerio Vasconcellos' protection for too long. I need him found." He drummed his fingers against the table. "You do that, and I'll tell you exactly where to find her." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Gabriel wasn't naive. This wasn't just a simple errand. Anyone hiding under Rogerio's protection wasn't just some random debtor. This was a man with connections, a man who knew things. And whatever this stranger wanted with him, it wasn't going to be pleasant. Gabriel's pulse pounded in his ears, his instincts screaming at him to walk away. But then he thought of Helena. He thought of the child he had never seen, the life that had been stolen from him. His hands curled into fists. No turning back now. He met the man's gaze, his voice cold, unwavering. "Tell me his name." "Nedad," The stranger let the tension linger, as if savoring the moment before revealing the next piece of the game. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper stained with oil and the faint scent of tobacco. He slid it across the table toward Gabriel without breaking eye contact. "His name's Álvaro Duarte," he said, his voice as cold as the metal walls surrounding them. "Ex-lawyer, ex-ally of Rogerio Vasconcelos. But more importantly, the only man still alive who knows the full extent of what happened the night Helena disappeared." Gabriel's fingers hesitated before picking up the paper, his breath steady but his pulse erratic. Álvaro Duarte. The name meant nothing to him, but the weight in the stranger's voice made it clear this man was no ordinary target. He unfolded the paper, revealing an old address scribbled in rushed handwriting. "Where is he now?" Gabriel asked, scanning the details. The stranger chuckled, shaking his head. "That's for you to figure out. Álvaro's been running for years, but word is he still has a soft spot for old habits, gambling, drinking, and disappearing just before the walls close in." Gabriel clenched his jaw. He knew the type, men who thought they could outrun their pasts, who believed they were too clever to get caught. Álvaro might have been smart enough to stay off Rogerio's radar, but now he was a key to the truth. "And when I find him," Gabriel asked, lifting his gaze back to the stranger, "what do you want me to do?" The stranger leaned forward, the dim light casting deep shadows over his face. "You don't ask questions. You bring him to me, and I tell you where Helena is." His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Simple, right? Nothing about this was simple. Gabriel knew that whatever Álvaro had done to end up on this man's list, it wasn't something small. If he was really the only survivor of that night's secrets, he was a man living on borrowed time. And now, Gabriel was the one sent to collect his debt. He exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the paper. "Fine," he said, his voice firm. "I'll find him." He pushed his chair back and stood, slipping the paper into his pocket. But before he could turn to leave, the stranger spoke again. "One last thing," he said, his voice almost casual. "Be careful, Gabriel. Álvaro's not just running from me. If Rogerio finds out you're looking for him, you'll be buried in the same grave he's been trying to dig for 5 years. Gabriel didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had already accepted the risk the moment he stepped into that warehouse. There was only one way forward now, and it was through the darkness. Gabriel stepped out of the warehouse, his breath forming small clouds in the cold night air. The city felt different now, less like a familiar landscape, and more like a maze designed to keep him from the truth. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, his fingers grazing the folded paper in his pocket. Álvaro Duarte. The name alone carried weight, but the real question was, where the hell do I start? He had no connections, no resources, just a name, a last known address, and the promise of a truth that was slipping further from his grasp. His first instinct was to head to the address scrawled on the paper, but he knew better than to expect Álvaro to be sitting there, waiting for him. If this man had survived this long, it was because he knew how to stay ahead of people like Gabriel, people desperate enough to track him down. So Gabriel needed to think like him, to figure out where a man on the run would go. He needed habits, patterns, weaknesses. And if Álvaro was the kind of man who ran to vices, then there was only one place to start looking, where people bet their lives away. Gabriel moved quickly through the streets, his destination clear. He wasn't looking for the polished casinos where men in suits sipped whiskey and played with house money. No, Álvaro wouldn't risk being anywhere that kept official records. He needed the underground spots, the ones hidden behind butcher shops, the ones where the air smelled like sweat, cheap alcohol, and desperation. The kind of places where debts weren't settled with money, but with blood. Gabriel knew these places well. He had seen enough men crawl into them looking for salvation, only to leave in a worse hell than the one they came from. It didn't take long to find one. Tucked behind a rundown bar, hidden from the curious eyes of the city, was a gambling den where the desperate clung to hope. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke. the dim light casting long shadows over men hunched around battered poker tables. Gabriel scanned the room, his heartbeat steady but his senses sharp. He wasn't looking for Alvaro yet. He was looking for someone who knew him, someone who would slip up at the mention of his name. He stepped up to the bar, his voice low and deliberate. "I'm looking for a man who owes me money," he said to the bartender, sliding a few bills across the counter. "Goes by Alvaro Duarte. Heard he used to be a regular." The bartender didn't even blink. He took the money, pocketing it before leaning in slightly. "You're not the only one looking for him," he muttered, his eyes flickering toward a dark corner of the room. Gabriel followed his gaze, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Sitting at a table, his hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey, was a man Gabriel recognized instantly. Not Alvaro, but one of Rogerio Vasconcelos's men. Gabriel's pulse quickened, but his expression remained unreadable. He had spent years locked up, learning how to suppress his emotions, how to control his breathing, even when his heart was pounding like a war drum. The man sitting in the corner was trouble. Gabriel knew that instantly. Rogerio Vasconcelos didn't send his men out for no reason. If one of them was here, it meant only one thing. Alvaro Duarte was running out of time, and if Gabriel wasn't careful, so was he. He turned back to the bartender, keeping his voice steady. "How long has he been asking about Alvaro?" The bartender hesitated, eyes darting to the side, clearly debating whether or not to keep talking. Gabriel didn't have time for games. He reached into his pocket, pulled out another bill, and placed it on the counter. The bartender exhaled, wiping down the already clean bar as he answered. "A couple of days," he murmured. "Didn't come alone the first time. There were 3 of them. Now it's just him waiting for something or someone." His eyes flickered up toward Gabriel. "If you're smart, you'll walk away now." Gabriel let out a slow breath, his mind working through the options. He couldn't afford to spook Rogerio's man, not before he had a lead on Alvaro, but he also couldn't sit around waiting for things to fall into place. He needed an opening, a way to get information without drawing suspicion. His gaze drifted toward the poker tables, where half-drunk men placed bets they couldn't afford to lose. That was it. He didn't need to fight for the information. He needed to win it. Gabriel grabbed a glass from the bar, filled it with whiskey, and made his way toward the table where Rogerio's man sat. He pulled out a chair without asking, sitting down across from him. The man barely glanced up, focused on the cards in his hand, but Gabriel could feel the tension rolling off him. "Mind if I join?" Gabriel asked, his tone casual, almost bored. The man's eyes flickered up at him now, dark and assessing. A muscle in his jaw twitched, but then he shrugged, sliding a few poker chips forward. "Suit yourself," he muttered. Gabriel smirked, taking a slow sip of his drink before tossing a chip onto the table. The game had begun, but this wasn't just about winning money. Gabriel studied him carefully with each hand, watching for the subtle movements, the way his fingers tapped against the table when he was nervous, the way his eyes darted to the door every time someone new walked in. This man wasn't just here to ask questions, he was waiting, which meant Alvaro was still close. Gabriel played his cards with precision, never betting too aggressively, but never folding too easily either. He needed time to work this man out, to find the right moment to push. And then, after 3 rounds of silence, Gabriel finally spoke. "Funny," he said, flipping a card over. "I heard there was someone else looking for Alvaro Duarte, some rich guy's errand boy. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" The man froze. It was subtle, just a slight stiffening of his shoulders, a flicker of tension in his grip, but Gabriel caught it. The air between them grew heavy, thick with unspoken threats. Slowly the man placed his cards down, leaning forward. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Gabriel held his gaze, offering a slow, calculated smile. "Just someone who wants to talk to him first," he said. "And you? You're in my way." The man's expression darkened. Gabriel had just made his move. Now, All that was left was to see how the other player would respond. The man across from Gabriel leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from suspicion to something colder. The dim glow of the poker table lights cast shadows across his sharp features, emphasizing the smirk curling at the edge of his lips. He was sizing Gabriel up now, measuring whether this was a fight worth having. Gabriel kept his posture relaxed, fingers lazily tracing the rim of his whiskey glass, but his entire body was coiled tight, ready to move at the first sign of trouble. He had spent enough time around men like this to know one thing: the ones who smirked were always the first to throw a punch. A tense silence stretched between them as the other players at the table glanced between the two men, sensing the shift in the air. The man finally exhaled, shaking his head with mock amusement. "You've got guts," he muttered, his fingers tapping against the table in an unsteady rhythm. "But you have no damn clue what you're walking into, do you?" His voice was low, but Gabriel heard the warning laced in it. The man wasn't bluffing. He was dangerous, not because he was the smartest guy in the room, but because he wasn't afraid of spilling blood to keep his secrets buried. Gabriel shrugged, keeping his expression neutral. "I walk into a lot of things," he said, his voice calm even. "And I usually walk out." He leaned forward, placing a few more poker chips into the pot. "The question is, are you the kind of guy who plays it safe, or do you like to take risks?" The man's smirk twitched, but his eyes burned with something darker. "I don't gamble with dead men," he said, voice sharp. The words barely left his mouth before his hand moved, fast, precise. Gabriel had been waiting for it. The man lunged, flipping the poker table between them. Glass shattered, whiskey spilled, and the other players scrambled back with curses. Gabriel barely had time to react before the man's fist connected with his ribs, sending a jolt of pain through his torso. But he didn't go down. He twisted his body, absorbing the blow just enough to keep his footing, and then struck back. His knuckles collided with the man's jaw, snapping his head to the side. The impact sent a sharp sting up Gabriel's arm, but he didn't stop. He grabbed the man by the collar, slamming him against the bar, sending bottles crashing to the floor. The bartender shouted, but Gabriel wasn't listening. He pressed his forearm against the man's throat, pinning him in place. "Where's Alvaro?" he growled, his breath coming fast. The man struggled, gritting his teeth, but Gabriel could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Pain, panic. He wasn't used to losing. "You're dead," the man spat, his voice strained. "You have no idea." Gabriel shoved harder, cutting him off. "Where is Alvaro?" His voice was dangerously low now, his patience razor thin. He had spent 5 years in a cell waiting for answers. He wasn't going to waste another second. The man's resistance faltered, his breath ragged. Then, finally, he let out a hoarse chuckle. "You think you're the only one after him?" he rasped. "You're already too late." Gabriel felt his stomach tighten, his grip unconsciously tightening. "What the hell does that mean?" The man let out a strained laugh, his teeth streaked with blood. "He's already running," he muttered. "And if you don't find him soon, Rogerio will." Gabriel's blood ran cold. Alvaro was slipping through his fingers. And if Rogerio Vasconcelos got to him first, the truth would be buried forever. Gabriel loosened his grip just enough for the man to cough and suck in a breath, his chest rising and falling erratically. The dim light of the bar cast jagged shadows across his bloodied face, his smirk now laced with something different. Satisfaction. He had delivered a message, and he knew it had landed exactly where it was meant to. Gabriel could feel the weight of it pressing against his ribs. If Rogerio was already after Alvaro, then time wasn't just running out, it was gone. Every second wasted meant one thing. Alvaro Duarte was slipping further away, and with him, the truth about Helena. Gabriel took a step back, letting the man collapse against the bar, his fingers gripping the counter for support. The bartender, who had been smart enough not to interfere, finally let out a sharp breath, wiping his hands on his apron as if trying to rid himself of the tension in the air. "You need to leave," he he muttered, casting a wary glance toward the exit. "You made a mess. They'll be coming." Gabriel didn't need to ask who they were. Rogerio's men had eyes everywhere, and now Gabriel had made himself visible. He had played his hand too soon. He turned back to the man slumped against the bar, his voice low and urgent. Where was he last seen? The man wiped the blood from his lip, his amusement fading as reality set in. He had no leverage now, no reason to hold back. He let out a slow, shaky breath. "He was spotted near the old docks yesterday," he muttered. "But if Rogerio's after him, he won't be there for long." Gabriel's mind raced. The docks, a perfect place for a man on the run, secluded with plenty of exits. If Alvaro was smart, he'd already be planning his next move. But if Rogerio's men were closing in, Gabriel had no time to waste. He turned toward the exit, his pulse steady despite the storm raging in his mind. As he reached the door, the man's voice stopped him. "You won't make it in time," he rasped. Gabriel glanced over his shoulder, his jaw clenched. The man's smile was faint, but his eyes burned with certainty. Rogerio doesn't play games. Alvaro's already a dead man walking. Gabriel held his gaze for a moment, then pushed the door open, stepping into the cold night air. The city stretched before him, filled with secrets and dangers he could no longer ignore. He had one chance to get to Alvaro before Rogerio did, and he sure as hell wasn't going to waste it. The night air hit Gabriel like a slap to the face, cold and unforgiving. He moved quickly, his boots striking against the pavement with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. The docks weren't far, but the distance wasn't the problem. It was the unknown. Alvaro was running, Rogerio's men were hunting him, and Gabriel was somewhere in the middle, chasing a ghost with nothing but a vague lead and the fire in his chest. He had spent 5 years behind bars, but this was the first time he truly felt like he was running out of time. As he cut through the narrow alleyways, his mind raced through every possibility. Alvaro was smart. He had to be, to survive this long. He wouldn't just be sitting in an open warehouse waiting to be found. If he was at the docks, it was because he was planning his escape. A boat, a smuggler, something that would get him out of the city before Rogerio's men closed in. Gabriel had to get to him first, had to corner him before he disappeared for good. The thought made his hands clench into fists. He wasn't going to let this lead slip away. Not after everything. The streets grew quieter as he neared the industrial outskirts, where rusted shipping containers towered over the empty sidewalks like forgotten relics. The scent of salt and oil mixed with the damp air, filling his lungs as he approached the first row of abandoned buildings. He slowed his pace now, instincts sharpening. This wasn't a part of town where people asked questions. If Alvaro was hiding, this was exactly the kind of place he'd pick, somewhere no one would look twice at a man trying to disappear. Gabriel kept to the shadows, his ears tuned to every distant sound. A sudden noise, footsteps, made him stop dead in his tracks. He pressed himself against the side of a container, listening. The sound was faint, cautious. Someone else was here. His pulse hammered in his ears as he reached into his jacket, fingers brushing against the cold metal of the small knife he had tucked away. He had hoped he wouldn't need it, but hope was a dangerous thing in a place like this. Slowly, carefully, he edged forward, following the sound. And then, just as he turned the corner, he saw him. A figure, hunched over, moving fast between the stacks of containers. Gabriel didn't hesitate. "Alvaro!" he called out, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The figure froze, and then, without a second of hesitation, Alvaro ran. Gabriel lunged forward. The second Alvaro bolted, his muscles coiling with the force of his sprint. The air was thick with salt and rust, the scent clinging to his clothes as his boots pounded against the damp concrete. Alvaro was fast, too fast for a man who had been running for years. He weaved between the stacked shipping containers, his silhouette flickering in and out of sight like a shadow barely clinging to existence. Gabriel pushed harder, his breath steady despite the burn in his legs. He wasn't about to lose him. Not now. Not when the truth was just within reach. The docks were a labyrinth of rusted metal and forgotten machinery, their hulking forms looming in the darkness like silent witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. Gabriel could hear Alvaro's hurried steps echoing ahead, the scrape of shoes against gravel as he turned sharp corners, trying to shake his pursuer. But Gabriel wasn't a stranger to chasing ghosts. He had spent 5 years hunting the one person who had been stolen from him. He wasn't about to let this one disappear just as easily. He cut through a tight passage between containers, moving instinctively, predicting Alvaro's path before he even took it. A sudden clang rang through the air. Alvaro had knocked over a metal crate, sending it crashing onto the pavement. The noise was deafening in the stillness of the docks, sending a flock of birds scattering from a nearby rooftop. Gabriel barely slowed as he leaped over the obstacle, his eyes locked onto Alvaro's retreating figure. He was close now, just a few more seconds. He reached out, fingertips grazing the back of Alvaro's shirt before the man twisted violently, throwing himself sideways in a last-ditch effort to break free. Gabriel skidded to a halt, his body slamming against the side of a container as Alvaro stumbled into an open clearing. For a split second, both men stood there, breathing hard, staring at each other in the dim moonlight. Alvaro's eyes were wide with fear, his chest rising and falling in quick, panicked bursts. He looked nothing like the powerful lawyer he had once been. His clothes were wrinkled, his face gaunt, his hair streaked with sweat and desperation. He was a man who had been living on borrowed time. A man who knew his past was finally catching up to him. Gabriel took a slow step forward, his voice calm but firm. "You can't run forever," he said, his breath still heavy from the chase. "We both know that." Alvaro swallowed hard, his hands trembling at his sides. His gaze darted past Gabriel toward the endless stretch of water beyond the docks, as if considering making one last escape. But there was nowhere left to go, nowhere left to hide. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely more than a whisper. "You don't understand," he rasped, shaking his head. "If I talk, we both die." Gabriel kept his stance firm, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. Alvaro's words hung in the air like a curse, thick and suffocating. "We both die." The way he said it wasn't an exaggeration. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, a certainty that had already carved itself into his bones. Gabriel had seen men afraid before, had watched inmates break under the weight of their own guilt, their own regrets. But this was different. This was the terror of a man who had been living with the devil breathing down his neck for years. A cold gust of wind swept through the docks, rustling loose papers and carrying the distant hum of the city beyond. Gabriel took a step closer, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Then tell me who we're running from," he said, his eyes never leaving Alvaro's. "Because I'm done being in the dark. I've already lost too much." His words struck something in Alvaro. Gabriel could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his fingers twitched like he was fighting the urge to reach for something that wasn't there. A cigarette, a drink, a weapon, anything to make him feel like he still had control. Alvaro licked his lips, his breathing still uneven. "You think this is just about Helena?" he muttered, his voice hollow. "You think it's just about you?" He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You have no idea how deep this goes, do you?" Gabriel clenched his fists, patience wearing thin. "Then enlighten me." Alvaro scoffed, but there was no real defiance in it, just exhaustion. He wiped a hand down his face before locking eyes with Gabriel, his expression grim. "Rogerio Vasconcelos isn't just trying to keep Helena away from you," he said. "He's protecting something bigger, something that, if exposed, could bring him down for good." Gabriel's pulse spiked, a dangerous mix of adrenaline and rage pulsing through his veins. "What is it?" he demanded. Alvaro hesitated, looking past Gabriel as if he could see the walls closing in around them. He exhaled sharply, his breath visible in the cold night air. "It's not just about Helena's disappearance," he murmured. "It's about what she knows." He took a slow step forward, lowering his voice as if the night itself was listening. She found out something, Gabriel. Something she was never supposed to know. That's why she was taken. That's why you were framed. Gabriel's chest tightened, his mind racing to keep up. He had spent years believing Helena was gone, believing that his imprisonment was just an act of cruelty, a way to punish him for being with her. But now the pieces were shifting, forming a picture far more sinister. What did she find out? Gabriel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alvaro opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, a sharp crack split the night, a gunshot. Gabriel barely had time to react before Alvaro staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, he stood there, frozen, his eyes wide with shock. Then slowly he crumpled to the ground, blood spreading across his chest like ink spilling over a page. Gabriel's breath hitched, his instincts screaming at him to move. He spun around just in time to see a dark figure disappear into the shadows between the shipping containers. A sniper. They had been followed. They had been watched. Adrenaline flooded Gabriel's veins as he dropped to his knees beside Alvaro, pressing a hand against the wound. "Stay with me," he growled, his voice raw. Alvaro's fingers grasped weakly at Gabriel's jacket, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He tried to speak, but only a choked wheeze came out. Gabriel leaned in, desperation clawing at his throat. "What did she know, Alvaro?" he urged. "Tell me." Alvaro's lips trembled, his body shuddering. And then, with his final breath, he forced out two words. "The ledger." His body went still, his grip loosened. And just like that, the only man who could have given Gabriel the answers he needed was gone. Gabriel felt the weight of Alvaro's lifeless body against him, his pulse pounding in his ears, as if his own heart was trying to tear through his ribs. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the salt in the air, thick and nauseating. His hands trembled, still pressed against the man's chest, though there was nothing left to save. The ledger. The words rattled in his skull, looping over and over like a siren wailing in the distance. He had no idea what it meant, but one thing was clear. Someone had been willing to kill to keep it a secret, and now they would be coming for him too. His instincts screamed at him to move, but his body remained frozen for a second too long. Then, the sharp echo of hurried footsteps against metal snapped him back into reality. They weren't done. His head jerked up, scanning the maze of containers, searching for the shooter. The docks were too open, too exposed. He needed cover, needed to disappear before he became the next body on the ground. With one last glance at Alvaro's still form, he forced himself to his feet and sprinted. A second gunshot cracked through the night, tearing into the container beside him. Sparks flew as metal dented under the impact, but Gabriel didn't stop. He ducked, weaving through the narrow alleys between the shipping crates, his breath burning in his throat. He could hear them now, the sound of more than one pair of footsteps closing in fast. Whoever had taken out Alvaro wasn't alone, and now they were hunting him. He clenched his jaw, pushing himself forward, his mind racing through his options. He had no weapon, no plan, just instincts and desperation, and that had to be enough. A sharp turn led him to a loading area near the edge of the docks. A rusted truck sat abandoned, crates stacked beside it like a makeshift barricade. Gabriel didn't hesitate. He dove behind them, pressing his back against the cold metal, his breaths coming in short, ragged bursts. He forced himself to listen. The footsteps slowed. They were searching now, moving methodically, sweeping the area like wolves closing in on wounded prey. Gabriel's fingers curled into fists. Think, move, survive. He had spent years locked away, waiting for the moment to reclaim his life. He wasn't about to let some hired gun take it from him now. Slowly, he peeked around the edge of the crate. Two men, dressed in dark clothing, moving with precision. Not just street thugs, professionals. One carried a suppressed pistol, scanning the area with calm efficiency. The other spoke into a radio, his voice too low for Gabriel to catch. But he didn't need to hear it to know what was happening. They were calling for backup. If he didn't act now, he'd never get another chance. His pulse steadied, his body tensed. And then, with a sharp inhale, he moved. Gabriel launched himself from behind the crates just as one of the men turned his head. The flicker of surprise in his expression was brief, just a fraction of a second, but it was all Gabriel needed. He lunged forward, closing the distance before the man could react. His shoulder slammed into the assassin's ribcage, sending them both crashing to the ground. The gun skidded across the pavement, disappearing into the darkness. The man let out a sharp grunt, but before he could recover, Gabriel struck. His fist connected with the side of the man's jaw, sending a jolt up his own arm, but he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. The second man reacted instantly, his footsteps pounding against the concrete as he rushed toward them. Gabriel barely had time to register the movement before the cold press of metal grazed his temple. Instinct kicked in. He twisted his body, dropping low as the bullet sliced through the space where his head had been a second before. The shot rang out like a thunderclap, echoing across the docks. Gabriel didn't give the shooter time to correct his aim. He surged forward, grabbing the first man's fallen gun from the ground and firing blindly. The second man ducked behind a container, avoiding the bullet by inches. But now the balance had shifted. Gabriel had a weapon. He didn't wait. He fired again, forcing the attacker to stay in cover as he turned his attention back to the man beneath him. The assassin groaned, dazed from the blow to his skull, but his hands were still moving, reaching for something. A knife. Gabriel reacted on pure survival instinct. His grip tightened around the stolen pistol. One shot. The man's body jerked before going limp. Gabriel had no time to dwell on it. He spun back around, searching for the second gunman. The air felt heavier now, charged with something raw and electric. The silence stretched, unnatural. Gabriel kept his breath steady, his finger firm on the trigger. He needed to move. Staying in one place was a death sentence. He edged toward the nearest stack of containers, his steps deliberate, his ears tuned to every shift in the wind. He knew the second man was still there, waiting, watching. Then, a soft metallic click, the sound of a gun being cocked. Gabriel whipped around just in time to see the muzzle flash, too late to dodge, too late to react. A searing pain exploded across his side as the bullet grazed him, tearing through fabric and flesh. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to ignore the burning sensation as he lifted his own weapon. He fired once, twice. The second man stumbled back, his body slamming against the cold steel of a shipping container before crumpling to the ground. Gabriel's breath came in ragged gasps, his free hand pressing against his wounded side. It wasn't deep, but the pain was sharp, persistent. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, feeling the damp mix of sweat and blood. Two bodies lay still in the dark, their presence a grim reminder of what he had just done. But there was no time for hesitation, no time for guilt. He needed to get out of there before more of them came. Pushing through the pain, Gabriel staggered forward, scanning the area. Alvaro was dead. His only lead had been taken from him before he could make sense of it. But those last words, the ledger, he didn't know what it was. But someone had been willing to kill, to keep it buried. That meant one thing, it was the key to everything. And if he wanted to find Helena, if he wanted to uncover the truth, he had no choice but to find out exactly what was inside it. Gabriel gritted his teeth as he pushed forward, each step sending a sharp pulse of pain through his side. The wound wasn't deep, but it was enough to slow him down. He had to keep moving, had to disappear before more of Rogerio's men arrived. The docks were vast, a labyrinth of shipping containers and abandoned warehouses. But Gabriel knew that hiding wouldn't save him. He needed information. He needed to act before the trail went cold. Alvaro had mentioned the ledger, and if men were willing to kill to keep it secret, then it was the key to everything. He kept to the shadows, pressing his palm against the wound to slow the bleeding. The night was quiet now, but Gabriel knew better than to think he was safe. Rogerio wasn't the kind of man who let problems walk away. He would send more men, and next time, they wouldn't miss. Gabriel's thoughts churned as he slipped through the alley between warehouses, searching for a way out. The ledger. He had no idea what it contained, but it was enough to make Alvaro a target. What had Helena discovered? And why had Rogerio gone to such lengths to erase it? A distant engine roared to life, breaking the silence. Gabriel ducked behind a rusted truck, peering through the shadows. A black SUV idled near the entrance of the docks, headlights off, engine running. His heart pounded. Reinforcements. He had to move. Now. He scanned the area, searching for an escape route. His eyes landed on a side door of a nearby warehouse, slightly ajar. It was a risk, but it was better than being caught out in the open. Gabriel clenched his jaw and made his decision. The warehouse was pitch dark inside, the scent of oil and rust thick in the air. Gabriel moved carefully, his footsteps muffled against the concrete floor. He needed a lead, something, anything that could tell him where to go next. His fingers brushed against a dusty desk, searching blindly until they closed around something solid. A phone. He clicked the screen to life, and his pulse spiked. A single message glowed against the darkness. "Meet me at the old chapel. We don't have much time." Below the message, only one name, Mariana Duarte. Gabriel's breath hitched. Duarte, the same last name as Alvaro. His sister, his wife, whoever she was, she knew something. And if she had sent this message to Alvaro, then she was expecting him. Gabriel had just found his next lead. He pocketed the phone, ignoring the pain in his side. He wasn't out of the fire yet, but for the first time since stepping out of prison, he had a direction, he had a name, and he was damn sure going to find out what she knew. Gabriel tightened his grip on the phone, his fingers slick with sweat. Mariana Duarte. The name pulsed in his mind like a warning, another thread in a web he was only beginning to unravel. Whoever she was, she had been waiting for Alvaro, expecting him to show up at the old chapel. But Alvaro wasn't coming. He was lying back at the docks in a pool of his own blood, his secrets dying with him. Gabriel exhaled slowly, pressing his back against the cold metal shelves lining the warehouse walls. He needed to think. If Mariana had sent that message, she still had no idea what had happened tonight. The air inside the warehouse was heavy, thick with the scent of rust and old wood. A single sliver of moonlight leaked through a broken window, casting jagged shadows across the room. Gabriel took a cautious step forward, scanning the darkened space for anything useful. If Alvaro had been hiding out here, there had to be something else. Something that connected him to the ledger, to Mariana, to whatever truth Rogerio Vasconcelos had buried so deeply. His fingers grazed the edge of a notebook resting on the desk. He flipped it open, his eyes adjusting to the scribbled handwriting. The pages were filled with fragmented notes, dates, initials, addresses. Most of it didn't make sense at first glance, but one detail caught his attention. A name circled multiple times, almost as if Alvaro had been fixated on it. Padre Matias. Gabriel frowned, flipping through more pages, his mind racing. Mariana had told Alvaro to meet her at a chapel, and now here was a priest's name scrawled into Alvaro's notes, underlined and marked with a question. He wasn't one to believe in coincidences. Whatever was happening, the church wasn't just a meeting point, it was a key. A faint noise outside made Gabriel snap the notebook shut, his body going rigid. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. He stuffed the notebook into his jacket and took a steady breath. He had stayed too long. Pushing away from the desk, he moved toward the side door he had come through, keeping his footsteps light. A shadow passed by the window, and his stomach clenched. They had found the warehouse. Rogerio's men were closing in. Gabriel glanced around, searching for another way out. A ladder. It led up to a lofted storage area near the ceiling, where an old skylight sat half open. It was risky, but better than walking straight into a bullet. He moved quickly, climbing the ladder just as the warehouse door creaked open. Voices murmured below, too low for him to make out. He flattened himself against the metal beams above, holding his breath as the footsteps echoed beneath him. They were searching, looking for something or someone. Gabriel clenched his jaw. He had what he needed. Mariana Duarte, Padre Matias, the chapel. He didn't have time to waste. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the skylight, pushing it open just enough to slip through. The cold night air hit him like a shock as he hoisted himself onto the roof. He didn't look back. He ran. Gabriel moved fast across the rooftop, his breath coming in short, measured bursts. The city stretched out beyond the docks, a sea of darkened buildings and flickering streetlights. Below, the muffled voices of Rogerio's men carried through the night, their movements precise, methodical. They were searching the warehouse, tearing through the shadows he had just escaped. He had minutes, maybe less, before they realized he was gone. His wound throbbed, the pain sharp and insistent, but he pushed it aside. Pain could wait. Survival couldn't. The rooftop sloped downward toward an alley, the only escape route that wouldn't send him straight into enemy hands. He crouched low, scanning the street below. It was empty. Good. He slid down the metal surface, gripping the rusted edge before dropping silently onto a pile of discarded crates. His boots hit the ground with a dull thud, and he immediately pressed himself into the darkness of the alley, his heart hammering against his ribs. He forced himself to stay still, to listen. The sound of doors slamming echoed from the warehouse, a frustrated curse. Then another voice, colder, sharper. "He's not here! Spread out! Find him!" Gabriel exhaled slowly. They weren't leaving anytime soon. He had to keep moving. With a final glance toward the docks, he turned and disappeared into the back streets of the city, his mind set on only one destination, the chapel. Mariana Duarte had sent that message expecting Alvaro. If she realized he wasn't coming, she might run, or worse, she might already be in danger. Gabriel clenched his jaw, ignoring the dull ache in his side as he picked up his pace. He had no idea what Mariana knew, but if she had been in contact with Alvaro, then she was his only real lead. The streets grew quieter as he moved deeper into the outskirts of town, the city's heartbeats slowing in the dead of night. The chapel wasn't far now. He recognized the area, an old district lined with abandoned buildings where time had stopped years ago. The kind of place where people whispered prayers that no one answered. Gabriel's instincts prickled. It was too quiet. He approached cautiously, staying in the shadows, his eyes locked on the worn stone building ahead. The chapel's doors were slightly ajar, the interior swallowed in darkness. Something was wrong. He slipped inside, his footsteps light against the cracked tile floor. The scent of aged wood and candle wax lingered in the air, but the silence felt unnatural, heavy. His gaze swept the pews, the altar, the dimly lit corners. No sign of Mariana, no sign of anyone. He stepped forward, his fingers brushing against the back of a pew as he scanned the room. Then he saw it. A phone lying abandoned on the floor near the altar. The screen was cracked, the message still visible. "Meet me at the old chapel. We don't have much time." Gabriel's pulse spiked. Mariana had been here, but she wasn't alone. A creak echoed from the back of the chapel, the sound of someone shifting in the dark. Gabriel's body tensed. He wasn't the first one to arrive. And he sure as hell wasn't alone. Gabriel didn't move. His breath slowed, his pulse steady, despite the tension crackling in the air like an impending storm. The chapel was silent, but not empty. He could feel it. The presence of someone lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. His fingers twitched, itching for a weapon, but he didn't dare reach just yet. Whoever was there had chosen to stay hidden. That meant they were either terrified or calculating. The faint scent of lavender and old books drifted through the air, out of place against the musty wood and cold stone. A presence moved in the darkness near the confessionals, a shadow shifting just beyond the reach of the dim candlelight. Then a voice, soft, uncertain, but carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much. "You're not Alvaro," the woman said. There was no fear in her tone, only quiet resignation. Gabriel took a step forward, keeping his hands visible. "No," he admitted. "I'm not." He let the silence settle between them, gauging her reaction. She didn't run, didn't scream. That told him something. She had expected trouble. Maybe she had even been waiting for it. "Mariana Duarte?" he asked. The shadow hesitated before stepping into the light. She was younger than he expected, mid-30s at most, with dark, intelligent eyes that flickered with something between suspicion and exhaustion. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose braid, but it was clear she had been on edge. Her blouse was wrinkled, the fabric clinging to the tension in her shoulders. She studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. "Alvaro sent you?" she asked, but there was no hope in her voice, just dread. Gabriel exhaled, his jaw tightening. "He tried," he said, "but they got to him first." Mariana's face paled, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. Her hands clenched at her sides, and for a moment Gabriel saw past the suspicion. This wasn't just about Alvaro. She had just lost someone she cared about. "He told me to find you," Gabriel continued, keeping his voice steady. "Before he died, he mentioned something. The ledger." Her reaction was immediate. Her entire body went rigid, her breath hitching for just a fraction of a second before she masked it with a slow exhale. But Gabriel had already seen it. Whatever the ledger was, it wasn't just important, it was dangerous. Mariana looked past him toward the chapel doors, as if making sure they were still alone. Then she finally spoke, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "If Alvaro told you about the ledger, then you're already in more danger than you realize." Gabriel met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Then start talking," he said, "because I'm not leaving here without answers." Mariana's lips parted slightly, her breath shallow, as if she were weighing the risk of speaking against the danger of staying silent. Gabriel could see it in her eyes. She wasn't just afraid, she was trapped. She had been running from this truth for a long time, and Alvaro's death had only confirmed what she already knew. If she spoke, there was no going back. But if she didn't, she would be left alone in the dark, just like he had been for the past 5 years. She took a slow step back, gripping the edge of a wooden pew as if steadying herself. "The ledger isn't just a document," she finally said, her voice tight. "It's the document. Proof of every dirty deal, every bribe, every disappearance tied to Rogerio Vasconcelos. It's the one thing that could destroy him." She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the wood. "Helena found out about it. That's why she was taken. That's why they needed you out of the way." Gabriel's stomach twisted, anger rising like bile in his throat. He had spent years rotting in a cell, believing his imprisonment was just some cruel punishment for loving the wrong woman. But this was calculated. A deliberate move to silence Helena, to erase any trace of what she had discovered. "Where is it?" he asked, his voice lower now, edged with something sharp and dangerous. "Where's the ledger?" Mariana let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "If I knew, do you think I'd still be alive?" she muttered. "Alvaro spent years trying to track it down, following leads, paying off the right people, but every time he got close, someone ended up dead." She hesitated, then added, "including the man who wrote it." Gabriel's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Her gaze flickered toward the altar, as if looking at it would shield her from the truth. "Padre Matias," she whispered. "He was Rogerio's personal accountant, a man of numbers, not faith. He kept records of everything, tucked them away where no one could reach them. But then one day, he had a change of heart. He wanted to confess, to purge his sins, so he made copies." She let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "That was the last mistake he ever made." Gabriel felt his pulse quicken. "So the ledger was real," he murmured. "And now it's missing." Mariana nodded. "And we're not the only ones looking for it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we don't find it first, neither of us is getting out of this alive." Gabriel's jaw tightened as Mariana's words settled into his mind like a ticking bomb. "If we don't find it first, neither of us is getting out of this alive." The weight of the truth pressed down on him, suffocating, but it didn't break him. He had spent too many years accepting lies. He wasn't about to walk away from the only real lead he had. His thoughts turned to Helena. If she had discovered the ledger, if she had been taken because of it, then the answers weren't just about exposing Rogerio, they were about finding her. Mariana studied his face, her dark eyes searching for something, doubt, hesitation, fear, but Gabriel gave her nothing. He straightened, ignoring the throbbing pain in his side, his focus locked on her. "Padre Matias," he said, his voice steady. "If he created the ledger, then someone had to know where he kept it. Alvaro must have found something before he died." His mind worked fast, piecing together the scattered fragments of information. "He was still digging. He had notes. I saw them." Mariana inhaled sharply, realization dawning on her face. Did he mention a location? Anything about where Matias might have hidden it? She took a step closer, her urgency breaking through her earlier hesitation. Gabriel thought back to the notebook he had found in Alvaro's hideout. The name had been circled, underlined, Padre Matias, but there had been something else, something he hadn't processed in the chaos of the moment. He had addresses written down, Gabriel muttered, running a hand through his damp hair. One of them had to be connected to Matias. Mariana's fingers twitched at her sides, her mind clearly working through the same realization. "Then we need to get to them before Rogerio does," she said, her voice tight. "If his men find that ledger first, we're both dead before sunrise." She hesitated, then added, "And so is Helena." The name hit Gabriel like a gut punch, reigniting the fire that had kept him standing all these years. He clenched his fists, the pain in his ribs long forgotten. "Then we don't waste another second," he said. "We move now." Mariana nodded, but her expression remained tense. "There's just one problem," she said, glancing toward the entrance of the chapel. "If Alvaro's dead, that means Rogerio's men are already searching his hideouts. We won't be the only ones looking." Gabriel exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance. He had already come this far. He wasn't stopping now. "Then we find it first," he said, "and we make sure no one else does." Mariana didn't argue. She knew as well as Gabriel did, time wasn't on their side. Every second they wasted standing here meant Rogerio's men were getting closer, sweeping through Alvaro's old trails, erasing evidence, silencing anyone who had gotten too close. The ledger wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a loaded gun aimed at the most powerful man in the city. And if they didn't get to it first, they weren't just going to lose Helena, they were going to lose their lives. Gabriel turned toward the entrance of the chapel, his mind already racing ahead. "Where did Alvaro keep his records?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm churning inside him. "His hideout at the docks had some notes, but that place is already burned. He must have had somewhere else, somewhere safer." Mariana hesitated for only a second before nodding. "He did, but getting there won't be easy." She moved quickly toward the altar, reaching beneath the old wooden structure until her fingers found what she was looking for. A metallic click echoed in the silence as she pulled out a small revolver, the weight of it familiar in her grip. She checked the chamber, only 3 bullets left, not much, but enough. Gabriel arched an eyebrow, but Mariana didn't offer an explanation. She simply met his gaze with the quiet intensity of someone who had long since accepted the risks. "Alvaro had a safe house," she said, "an apartment outside the city, one he never listed under his real name. If he left any clues, they'll be there." Gabriel exhaled slowly, nodding. "Then that's our next stop." But Mariana didn't move. Her grip on the gun tightened, her expression unreadable. "There's something else you need to know," she said, her voice quieter now. "If Alvaro's dead, Rogerio isn't just going to send his men to clean up after him. He's going to tie off every loose end. That includes me, and now it includes you." She took a slow breath before continuing. "We're not just looking for the ledger anymore, Gabriel. We're at war." Gabriel didn't flinch. He had spent years trapped in a prison cell, years believing Helena was gone, years drowning in the weight of a life stolen from him. If war was what it took to get her back, then so be it. His voice was calm when he spoke. "Then let's finish what Alvaro started." Mariana studied him for a moment, then nodded. Without another word, she moved toward the side door of the chapel, her body tense but controlled. Gabriel followed, the night swallowing them whole as they disappeared into the shadows. The hunt wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The night stretched before them, vast and unforgiving. The city, once a familiar maze of memories and regrets, now felt more like a battlefield, one where every shadow could hide a bullet and every street could be a trap waiting to spring. Gabriel and Mariana moved quickly, their steps silent against the cracked pavement. Neither spoke. There was no need. The weight of what they were walking into had already settled between them, an unspoken understanding that words couldn't fix. Mariana led the way, her grip firm on the revolver tucked at her side. She moved with purpose, but Gabriel could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze flicked toward every darkened alley, every approaching set of headlights. She wasn't just leading him to Alvaro's safe house, she was leading them straight into the line of fire. "How far is it?" Gabriel finally asked, his voice quiet but firm. Mariana didn't break stride. 30 minutes if we take the back roads," she murmured. "Less if we steal a car." Gabriel smirked slightly at that, but there was no humor in it. "Let's stick to the back roads," he said. "Last thing we need is Rogerio getting a call about a stolen vehicle on the highway." Mariana didn't argue. She just nodded, tightening the strap of the bag slung over her shoulder. The city lights grew dimmer as they moved further from the center, replaced by industrial buildings and empty lots where no one asked questions. Gabriel could hear the distant hum of traffic, but here, in the outskirts, the world felt eerily still. Too still. His gut tightened with unease. "Something's off," he muttered, scanning their surroundings. Mariana glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Before Gabriel could answer, the sound of tires screeching against pavement cut through the silence like a knife. Headlights flared to life down the street, burning through the darkness as a black SUV skidded into view. Gabriel's pulse spiked. Rogerio's men. They had found them. "Run!" he barked, grabbing Mariana's arm and pulling her into the nearest alley just as the first gunshot rang out. The bullet ricocheted off the brick wall beside them, sending shards of stone flying. Mariana didn't hesitate. She broke into a sprint, her breath coming fast and sharp as they weaved through the narrow passage. Another shot. Closer this time. Gabriel didn't slow, his mind already mapping the quickest way out. "This way," he called, yanking Mariana toward a metal fire escape. They climbed fast, boots clanging against rusted steps, adrenaline drowning out the pain in Gabriel's wounded side. Below them, the SUV skidded to a stop, doors flying open, more men, more guns. Mariana reached the rooftop first, dropping to her knees as Gabriel hauled himself up beside her. They pressed against the ledge, hearts pounding as they listened to the men below. "They went up!" one of them shouted. "Cover the exits!" Gabriel clenched his jaw. They were surrounded, and now there was only one way out. He turned to Mariana, his voice low but firm. "We fight our way through." Gabriel's breath was steady, but his pulse pounded like war drums in his ears. Below, Rogerio's men spread out, their movements sharp and methodical, the way professionals hunted wounded prey. Flashlights cut through the darkness, beams bouncing off rusted metal and broken glass. They weren't searching, they were closing in. Every alley, every escape route was being sealed off. Gabriel and Mariana were outnumbered, outgunned, and backed against the edge of a rooftop with nowhere left to run. Mariana exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the revolver. Only 3 bullets. That meant 3 shots, 3 chances. And if she missed, if they both missed, the only thing left between them and a bullet to the skull was time. And not much of it. "If we stay here, we die," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we run, we get picked off before we hit the ground." Her jaw clenched, and she turned her gaze to Gabriel. "We need a distraction. Something to break their formation." Gabriel scanned their surroundings, his mind racing. The rooftop was littered with debris. Old metal pipes, shattered bricks, a forgotten generator half covered in grime. But then his eyes locked onto something else, a rusted water tank perched precariously on weak scaffolding near the rooftop's edge. One well-placed shot could bring it crashing down, giving them just enough time to slip through the chaos. His lips pressed into a thin line. "That water tank," he said, nodding toward it. "If we can drop it, we can make a break for the fire escape on the next building." Mariana followed his gaze, then looked down at the revolver in her hand. 3 bullets, 3 shots. She sucked in a breath, nodding once. "We'll only get one chance." Gabriel crouched lower, gripping a metal pipe like a makeshift weapon. "Then we don't miss." The moment was set. The tension crackled in the air like a brewing storm, the weight of life and death balanced on the edge of a trigger. Gabriel met Mariana's eyes, giving her a single nod. She inhaled sharply, then lifted the revolver, lining up the shot. The beam of a flashlight flickered closer. A voice shouted below, "There, on the roof!" Mariana pulled the trigger. The crack of the gunshot shattered the night, the bullet ripping through rusted metal. For a second, nothing happened. Then with a groaning shriek, the scaffolding beneath the water tank gave way. The massive structure tilted, then collapsed in a deafening crash, exploding onto the alleyway below. Water surged like a tidal wave, knocking over crates, metal beams, and most importantly, Rogerio's men. Gabriel didn't wait for the dust to settle. "Move!" he barked, grabbing Mariana's wrist as they sprinted toward the edge. The next rooftop was a 6-foot jump away. Nothing impossible, but with bullets flying it might as well have been a canyon. They didn't have time to hesitate. Together, they leaped. Mariana landed first, rolling to absorb the impact. Gabriel hit the ground hard, his injured side screaming in protest, but he pushed through it. More shouts erupted behind them, gunfire ringing out as the first men struggled back to their feet. Gabriel pulled Mariana up, their escape route still ahead. "We're not done yet," he muttered, blood staining the side of his shirt. "We need to disappear." And with that, they ran into the darkness, leaving only chaos in their wake. Gabriel forced himself to keep moving, his muscles burning from exertion, his wounds screaming for relief. He couldn't stop. Not now. The gunfire behind them had faded, replaced by the distant shouts of men scrambling to recover from the chaos they had left in their wake. They had bought themselves time, but not much. Rogerio's men wouldn't stop until they were either dead or buried so deep in the city's underbelly that no one would ever find them again. Mariana ran beside him, her breath ragged but controlled, her mind clearly racing as fast as their footsteps. She had grown up in this city, knew it better than most, but tonight the streets felt foreign, even to her. "This way," she murmured, grabbing Gabriel's arm and yanking him toward a narrow passageway between 2 abandoned buildings. He didn't question it. They slipped into the alley, disappearing into the darkness like ghosts. The space was tight, barely wide enough for them to move side by side. The walls were damp, graffiti-stained, the scent of rot and rust thick in the air. Gabriel pressed his back against the cold brick, forcing himself to take steady breaths as Mariana peeked around the corner, scanning for movement. "We lost them," she whispered, turning back to him. "For now." Gabriel let out a slow exhale, his fingers brushing against the damp fabric of his shirt. His side was slick with blood, but the wound wasn't deep enough to kill him, at least not yet. "We need to get off the streets," he muttered, his voice low. "Find somewhere to lay low until we can figure out our next move." Mariana hesitated, her brows furrowed in thought. Then she nodded. "I know a place." She didn't wait for his approval. She just started moving, and Gabriel followed. They weaved through the shadows, sticking to the back alleys and forgotten paths where no cameras, no patrols, and no prying eyes would find them. The city loomed around them like a beast waiting to devour them whole. But Mariana moved with purpose, her grip tight on the revolver, her steps silent as a whisper. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into an abandoned courtyard, the remnants of an old marketplace long since forgotten. A rusted metal staircase led up to a crumbling second-floor apartment, its windows boarded, its door hanging slightly ajar. Mariana climbed first, Gabriel right behind her, each step groaning under their weight. She pushed the door open carefully, revealing a small, dust-covered room with faded furniture and the scent of time pressing against the walls. "No one's been here for years," she murmured, stepping inside. "We'll be safe here, for now." Gabriel followed her in, closing the door behind them. Safe wasn't a word he believed in anymore, but for the first time tonight, at least, they weren't running. Gabriel pressed his back against the door, exhaling slowly as his muscles finally stopped screaming in protest. The apartment smelled of dust and neglect, the kind of place where time had settled in and refused to move. Dim moonlight filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting faint, fractured beams across the room. It wasn't much. Faded furniture, peeling wallpaper, a couch that looked like it had seen better days decades ago. But it was quiet. And right now, quiet meant survival. Mariana moved quickly, checking the corners of the apartment like someone who had done this before. She ran a hand along the windows, testing the wooden planks covering them. "No one's been here in a long time," she murmured, mostly to herself. "We should be clear for the night." Gabriel watched her, noting the precision in her movements. She was scared, sure, but she wasn't unraveling. That was rare. Most people broke under pressure. She was holding on, for now. He finally peeled his hand away from his wound, grimacing as he looked down. The blood had slowed, but the fabric of his shirt was soaked, clinging to his skin like a second layer. He needed to clean it. "Got anything for this?" he asked, motioning toward his side. Mariana hesitated, then nodded, disappearing into a side room. Gabriel sank onto the worn couch, the springs groaning under his weight. His body ached, exhaustion settling into his bones, but he couldn't afford to rest yet. The events of the night played on repeat in his head. Alvaro's final words, the sound of gunfire, the weight of the ledger pressing against every moment. Mariana returned with a half-empty first aid kit and a bottle of whiskey. She dropped them onto the table before sitting across from him, her expression unreadable. "This is all I could find," she said, unscrewing the cap of the whiskey. "It's not much, but it'll keep you from getting an infection." Gabriel let out a dry chuckle. "That, or it'll kill me faster." He took the bottle from her, pouring some of the liquid over his wound before sucking in a sharp breath as the burn seared through him. Mariana didn't flinch. She just handed him a strip of cloth. "Press that against it. It'll slow the bleeding." Gabriel did as she said, tying the cloth tightly around his ribs. The pain dulled slightly, though exhaustion made it harder to ignore. He watched as Mariana leaned forward, rubbing a hand over her face, her mind clearly racing. "You don't have to stay," he said after a moment. "If you run now, you might have a chance at getting out of this." Mariana looked up, her dark eyes locking onto his. There was no hesitation in her voice when she spoke. "I'm not running." Gabriel studied her for a moment before nodding. He wasn't sure if that made her brave or just as desperate as he was. Gabriel watched as Mariana leaned back against the faded armchair, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The dim glow from a broken lamp barely illuminated the room, casting long, distorted shadows across the peeling wallpaper. She was exhausted. He could see it in the way her body sagged, in the stiffness of her movements, but she wasn't letting herself break. Not yet. There was a fire in her, something deeper than fear, something that told him she wasn't just caught in this mess. She had chosen to stay in it. "You don't owe me anything," Gabriel said, his voice quieter now. "Alvaro is gone. You could walk away from all this and no one would blame you." He wasn't saying it to push her away. He meant it. If she left now, maybe, just maybe, she could disappear before Rogerio's men set their sights on her for good. But Mariana's expression didn't change. She let out a slow breath, her fingers tapping against the armrest, then shook her head. "You think I don't know that?" she murmured. "You think I don't want to disappear, to pretend none of this ever happened?" She scoffed, shaking her head. "But there's no walking away from Rogerio. Alvaro tried. Helena tried. And look where they ended up." Gabriel's jaw tightened at the mention of Helena. 5 years. 5 years of believing she was dead, of mourning a lie. And yet, she was still out there. Somewhere. He clenched his fists. the memory of Alvaro's last words ringing in his head. The ledger. That was the key, the last piece of the puzzle. And if Mariana was willing to help him, then maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. "You're sure about this?" he asked, leveling his gaze at her. "Because once we take the next step, there's no going back." Mariana exhaled, then reached into her bag, pulling out a folded piece of paper. She hesitated for only a second before sliding it across the table toward him. "Alvaro's safe house," she said. "I told you he had a place outside the city. He kept everything there, documents, notes, anything he found on Rogerio over the years. If he had any leads on the ledger, they'll be there." Her voice dropped slightly. "But if Rogerio's men know about it, they'll be heading there too." Gabriel unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the address. It was on the outskirts of town, deep enough into abandoned territory that no one would be watching. That meant one thing. It was either completely untouched, or it was already a trap. He looked back at Mariana, nodding once. "Then we go now." He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the dull pain pulsing through his side. "Before they get there first." Mariana hesitated for only a moment before standing as well. She tucked the revolver into the back of her waistband, then met his gaze. "We move fast. We stay low," she said, her voice sharper now, more focused. "And if anything feels off, we don't hesitate." Gabriel smirked faintly despite everything. "I think I'm starting to like you," he muttered, grabbing the map and stuffing it into his jacket. Mariana rolled her eyes, but there was the faintest hint of a smile before she turned toward the door. "Let's just not get killed before sunrise, okay?" With that, they slipped back into the night, stepping off the edge of safety and into the unknown. The city blurred past them as Mariana gripped the steering wheel, her fingers tense against the worn leather. The road stretched out ahead, endless and desolate, the streetlights growing scarcer the farther they drove. Gabriel sat in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the windshield. The adrenaline from their escape was fading, replaced by the steady drum of exhaustion, but neither of them could afford to slow down. Alvaro's safe house was their only lead, their only chance to find the ledger before Rogerio's men did, and if it was a trap, they would deal with it when they got there. The hum of the engine was the only sound between them for a long stretch of road. Gabriel adjusted the makeshift bandage on his side, wincing slightly at the dull sting. The wound wasn't fatal, but it would slow him down if things went south. He exhaled, shifting his focus back to the road. "How much farther?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. Mariana didn't take her eyes off the highway. 15, 20 minutes, she murmured. "The place is isolated, off the grid." Alvaro didn't trust easy. He made sure no one could find him unless he wanted them to. Gabriel nodded, processing her words. "And yet, Rogerio's men are already on his trail," he muttered. "That means someone talked, someone close." The realization settled heavily between them. If Alvaro had gone through so much trouble to disappear, then the only way Rogerio could have found him was through betrayal. Mariana's grip on the wheel tightened. "I've been thinking the same thing," she admitted. Alvaro didn't work alone. He had contacts, people who owed him favors. But if Rogerio found him, that means one of those people flipped. She hesitated before adding, "And if they knew where he was, they might know where we're going too." Gabriel clenched his jaw. They weren't just racing against time. They were racing against an enemy who already knew their next move. He pulled the folded paper from his jacket, scanning the address again. "We can't just walk in blind," he said. "If Rogerio's men got there first, we need an advantage." Mariana shot him a glance. "Like what?" Gabriel thought for a moment before answering. "Surprise? They won't expect us to know they're already there." He exhaled sharply. "We go in quiet, we scout first, and if it's a trap..." He trailed off, but Mariana understood. She nodded, her focus sharp. "Then we make sure they regret waiting for us." The road ahead stretched into blackness, and neither of them spoke again. There was no point in discussing what-ifs. They were already past the point of no return. Whatever waited for them at the safe house, answers, betrayal, or a bullet, it didn't matter. They were going, and they weren't leaving empty-handed. The headlights cut through the thick darkness as Mariana turned off the main road, guiding the car onto a dirt path barely visible beneath the overgrown weeds. The terrain grew rougher, the suspension groaning as they pressed forward. Gabriel kept his eyes on the landscape, scanning for any movement, any sign that they weren't alone. The safe house was close now, hidden deep within the outskirts, away from prying eyes. Alvaro had chosen this place for a reason, but Rogerio's men weren't blind. If they had tracked him, they could be waiting. Mariana slowed the car to a crawl, then killed the engine. The silence was immediate, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint rustling of trees in the wind. They sat there for a moment, both listening, both waiting. Gabriel's fingers hovered near the grip of his gun, his body coiled tight with anticipation. "We go in quiet," he murmured. Mariana nodded, her expression unreadable. She reached into the glove compartment, pulling out a small flashlight, then tucked the revolver into the waistband of her jeans. "If something feels off, we fall back," she whispered. "No heroics." Gabriel smirked faintly. "No promises." They stepped out of the car, the cool night air wrapping around them like a warning. The safe house stood ahead, a small cabin barely distinguishable from the surrounding trees. It looked abandoned, no lights, no movement, but that meant nothing. Rogerio's men weren't amateurs. If they were here, they'd be waiting in the dark, just like Gabriel and Mariana were now. They moved carefully, keeping low, their steps silent against the dirt. Gabriel reached the cabin first, pressing his back against the wall as he glanced toward Mariana. She crouched beside him, her breath steady despite the tension in her body. He gestured toward the front door. It was slightly ajar. His stomach twisted. "That's not a good sign," he murmured. Mariana's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "We check inside, fast and clean." Gabriel took point, pushing the door open inch by inch. The hinges didn't creak. Whoever had been here before them had already made sure of that. He stepped inside, his body low, eyes adjusting to the darkness. The scent of stale air and old wood filled his lungs. A desk sat against the far wall, papers scattered across its surface. A chair lay overturned nearby, signs of a struggle. His fingers curled around his gun. "Someone's been here," he whispered. Mariana slipped in behind him, her flashlight flickering over the walls. "And not long ago." Gabriel's eyes locked onto something near the desk. A dark stain smeared across the floorboards. "Blood," he exhaled slowly. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been clean. His gut told him they weren't the first to arrive. The real question was, were they too late? Gabriel's eyes lingered on the dark smear of blood staining the floorboards, his mind racing through possibilities. The room was silent, but not in the way abandoned places usually were. It wasn't the stillness of emptiness. It was the stillness left behind after violence. He stepped forward cautiously, scanning the shadows for movement, but nothing stirred. Whoever had been here was either dead or gone. The only question was whether they had left willingly or been taken. Mariana moved beside him, sweeping the flashlight over the overturned chair and scattered papers. "This wasn't a break-in," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whoever was here, they knew what they were looking for." Gabriel nodded. The mess wasn't random. The drawers had been yanked open, files pulled apart, but not everything had been destroyed. Some documents were left untouched, as if the intruders had only been after something specific. The ledger. They were looking for it too. Gabriel crouched near the desk, his fingers brushing over the scattered pages. Bank statements, offshore accounts, names scribbled in Alvaro's frantic handwriting, pieces of a puzzle that only made sense to a man who hadn't lived long enough to explain them. "He was tracking something," Gabriel muttered, flipping through the papers. His eyes landed on one page in particular, a list of names, half of them crossed out in red ink. His stomach twisted. These weren't just names. These were people, targets. Mariana peered over his shoulder, her breath catching. "This is a hit list," she murmured. Some of these names, they're politicians, businessmen, high-ranking officials. Her fingers traced over one name in particular, her expression darkening. Raul Sampaio, she read aloud. He was found dead 3 months ago. They called it a heart attack. She let out a bitter laugh. Looks like Rogerio had a different diagnosis. Gabriel's grip on the papers tightened. Alvaro was building something bigger than just exposing Rogerio, he said. He was tracking every move, every death, every accidental disappearance. He exhaled sharply. The ledger wasn't just proof of corruption. It was a kill order. A list of everyone Rogerio considered a threat. Mariana took a slow step back, her fingers brushing against the desk as if grounding herself. If Rogerio's men were here, and they didn't find the ledger, she met Gabriel's gaze, her voice steady but laced with urgency. That means it's still out there. Gabriel rose to his feet, stuffing the papers into his jacket. Then we have one advantage left, he said. We know what we're looking for, and we know what Rogerio's afraid of. His gaze flickered to the bloodstain on the floor one last time. But we need to move fast, because whoever left this behind, he gestured to the stain. They either have the ledger, or they died trying to protect it. Mariana swallowed hard, nodding. So where do we go next? Gabriel looked back at the scattered names, his mind already connecting the pieces. We find someone who isn't crossed off this list, he said, someone who's still alive. And before Rogerio's men got to them, they had to make sure that person stayed that way. Mariana's hands trembled slightly as she ran her fingers over the list, scanning the remaining names. The weight of what they had just uncovered pressed down on both of them. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore, it was about survival. Every name on this list had been marked for death, and if Rogerio's men had already been here, it meant the clock was ticking. Whoever was next wouldn't stay alive for long. Gabriel took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. We need to find someone before they do, he said, scanning the names again. Someone who's still breathing and knows enough to point us in the right direction. His eyes flicked across the page, noting the ones crossed out in deep, angry strokes. Most were already gone. Raul Sampaio, a journalist named Mauro Dantas, a former judge who had retired early. Then his gaze landed on the last few names still intact. One stood out, Dr. Esteban Montero. Mariana read it at the same time he did, her brow furrowing. Montero, she murmured. I've heard that name before. She grabbed one of the scattered documents from the floor, flipping through the pages until she found what she was looking for, a financial statement detailing heavy payments made to an unknown account. Here, she said, pointing. Alvaro was tracking large payments from Rogerio's front companies to someone under a coded alias. But he didn't finish decoding it. She turned to Gabriel, her expression sharp. If Montero is on the list and tied to these payments, that means he's not just some random target. He knows something. Gabriel didn't need convincing. He memorized the name, the details, the urgency that crackled in the air. Where does he live? He asked. Mariana hesitated, flipping through another folder before finding a partially written note in Alvaro's handwriting. Last known location, Santa Isabel. She frowned. That's a small town outside the city. Rural, quiet. If he's hiding, that's exactly where I'd expect him to be. Gabriel stuffed the documents into his jacket, his jaw tight. Then that's where we go. Mariana exhaled, nodding, but her eyes still lingered on the bloodstain near the desk. And what if we're too late? She asked, voice quieter now. What if Rogerio's men have already found him? Gabriel's expression darkened. Then we don't just find a witness. He checked the magazine in his stolen pistol, making sure it was full. We make an example out of whoever got there first. Mariana held his gaze for a moment, then nodded, reaching for her revolver. No more running. No more hiding. They had a name, a location, and a single chance to get ahead of the men hunting them. If Dr. Esteban Montero was still breathing, they were going to make damn sure he stayed that way. Without another word, they slipped out of the safe house and back into the night. knowing that from this point forward, every move they made had to be faster, smarter, and deadlier than the men coming for them. The road stretched endlessly before them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkened countryside. The headlights barely illuminated the path ahead, the dense trees lining the highway casting eerie shadows that flickered with each passing mile. Mariana gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white from the tension radiating off her. Gabriel sat beside her, staring out at the empty road, his mind racing through every possible scenario that could await them in Santa Isabel. If Montero was still alive, they had to get to him first. If he wasn't, they had to find out who got to him, and fast. Neither of them spoke at first. The weight of their mission sat heavy between them, pressing against their chests like a silent warning. Gabriel adjusted the documents inside his jacket, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of his pistol. He hated feeling unprepared, but at this point, all they had was instinct and a thin thread of information that could snap at any moment. "You sure about this guy?" he finally asked, his voice low but firm. "Montero's more than just another loose end." Mariana nodded, her eyes never leaving the road. "Alvaro wouldn't have written his name down if he wasn't important," she said. "He tracked every piece of money flowing through Rogerio's empire, and if Montero was receiving payments through a coded alias, it means he was either in deep or he knew something that made him dangerous." She hesitated, exhaling slowly. "Doctors don't usually end up on hit lists unless they've seen something they weren't supposed to." Gabriel frowned, considering her words. A doctor. That changed things. If Montero was involved in Rogerio's network, it wasn't just about money. It could be about people, smuggling, cover-ups. The possibilities spiraled in his mind, none of them good. "And what if he's already dead?" he asked. "What if we're driving straight into another crime scene?" Mariana glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Then we find out why he was killed," she said simply. "And we use that to get to the ledger." Gabriel smirked faintly, despite the tension in the air. "You make it sound easy." She let out a short breath, something almost like a laugh. "Nothing about this is easy, Gabriel." The miles continued to roll by, the silence stretching between them once more. Every second felt like a countdown, a slow race against the men who were always one step ahead. Gabriel checked his gun again, his thoughts circling the same conclusion. Santa Isabel wasn't going to be a safe haven, it was going to be a battlefield, and they had no choice but to walk straight into it. The road narrowed as they approached Santa Isabel, the streetlights becoming fewer, the darkness pressing in closer. It wasn't the kind of town that welcomed outsiders, especially not at this hour. The buildings were old, their paint peeling under the weight of time. The sidewalks were empty, the only signs of life coming from a lone bar on the corner, its neon sign flickering weakly in protest against the silence surrounding it. Mariana slowed the car, her gaze sharp as she scanned the quiet streets. "Small town," she murmured, "easy to disappear in. Easy to get buried in, too." Gabriel nodded, his fingers tapping lightly against his knee. Every instinct in his body screamed that they weren't alone. The air felt wrong, thick with the kind of tension that only came when people knew something was about to go very, very bad. He leaned forward slightly, scanning the storefronts, the alleys, the parked cars that looked just a little too abandoned. "People are watching," he muttered, "even if we can't see them yet." Mariana pulled into an empty lot beside a rundown pharmacy, cutting the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence settled, stretching, waiting. Then she turned to him. "We do this fast," she said. "In and out. No making noise unless we have to." Gabriel exhaled slowly. Agreed. He reached for the gun at his waist, adjusting it beneath his jacket. Where was Montero's last known address? Mariana pulled out a crumpled paper from her jacket and unfolded it carefully. A clinic on the east side of town. Said he was still practicing medicine, mostly under the table, helping people who couldn't afford hospital bills. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "That means people around here know him." If he's gone, someone will notice. Gabriel took one last glance at the streets before opening his door. Then let's find out if he's still breathing. They moved quickly, their steps soundless against the cracked pavement. The deeper they went into the town, the more it felt like walking into a place that had already decided their fate. The buildings leaned close, their windows dark, but Gabriel knew better than to think no one was watching. This wasn't just a quiet town. It was a town holding its breath, waiting. Mariana stopped in front of an old brick building with a faded sign above the door. Dr. Esteban Montero, Clínica Geral. The place looked abandoned, but the lights inside told a different story. Gabriel's gut tightened. "We go in slow," he whispered, "and we stay ready." Mariana nodded, reaching for her revolver. "Let's hope he's still alive to answer our questions." Gabriel pushed open the door, stepping into the unknown once again. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and dust, the sterile scent failing to mask the decay of a place long past its prime. Faded posters of medical diagrams lined the peeling walls, their corners curling with age. A single fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows that made the room feel smaller than it was. Gabriel stepped inside first, his body tense, eyes scanning every corner. The waiting area was empty. No patients, no receptionist, just silence. Too much silence. Mariana followed closely, her fingers brushing against the grip of her revolver. "This doesn't feel right," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel agreed. A doctor running an underground clinic should have had people coming and going, especially at this hour. But there was no movement, no distant murmur of voices from behind the office doors. Just the hollow hum of the flickering light. "Montero?" Gabriel called out, his voice steady but firm. No answer. The silence stretched, thick with something unspoken. He moved toward the reception desk, his fingers brushing against an old appointment book left open on the counter. The last recorded entry was from 2 nights ago. His gut tightened. That meant Montero had been here recently, before everything went quiet. He flipped through the pages, scanning hastily scribbled notes, until something caught his eye. A name, not a patient, but a visitor. Álvaro Duarte. The date was fresh, the same night Álvaro was killed. Gabriel clenched his jaw. "He was here," he muttered. "Before he died, he came to see Montero." Mariana's breath hitched, her eyes darting toward the hallway leading deeper into the clinic. "Then Montero knows something," she whispered. "Or worse, he's the reason Álvaro's dead." Gabriel didn't respond. He was already moving, his instincts screaming at him to get to the back offices before it was too late. He pushed through the first door on his right, entering what looked like a small examination room. The medical bed was unmade, the drawers slightly ajar. Someone had been in here recently, but it wasn't Montero. A sudden noise, a creak. Gabriel spun, gun raised, just as a shadow moved at the end of the hall. Mariana stiffened beside him, her own weapon drawn. "Someone's here," she murmured. Gabriel took a slow step forward, his grip firm on the pistol. "Montero!" he called out again. "If you're alive, now's the time to say something." Another creak, then silence. Gabriel's pulse quickened. This wasn't just an abandoned clinic. It was a trap waiting to spring. Gabriel's grip on his pistol tightened as he took another step forward, the weight of the silence pressing against his ribs like a warning. The air in the clinic was thick, stagnant, heavy with the scent of antiseptic and something more bitter, something metallic. Blood. His mind raced through the possibilities. If Montero was still here, he might already be dead. If he wasn't, then someone else was waiting for them. Either way, they weren't alone. Mariana moved beside him, her steps calculated, revolver raised. She didn't speak, but Gabriel could feel her tension, the way her body braced for whatever was coming. Another creak echoed from the end of the hall, followed by the faintest shuffle of movement. Not footsteps, something softer, someone trying to stay quiet. Gabriel exhaled slowly. Whoever it was, they were afraid. That didn't mean they weren't dangerous. They reached the last door, its frosted glass panel marked Consultorio, Montero's private office. Gabriel pressed his back against the wall beside it, glancing at Mariana. She gave him a small nod. No hesitation, no second-guessing. He reached for the handle and pushed the door open, his gun raised. The room was dim, the only light coming from a small desk lamp still flickering weakly in the corner. Papers were strewn across the desk, medical records mixed with handwritten notes, some of them crumpled as if someone had been trying to destroy them in a hurry. And then Gabriel saw him. Dr. Esteban Montero was crouched in the corner, his hands trembling, his breath ragged. He wasn't tied up, wasn't wounded, but his face was a mask of sheer panic. His eyes darted to the gun in Gabriel's hand, then to Mariana, his body coiled like a man who had been running for too long, but had nowhere left to go. "Please," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "Don't shoot." Gabriel didn't lower the gun. "Depends," he said. "Are you the reason Alvaro Duarte is dead?" Montero's breath hitched, his fingers curled against the floor, his knuckles white. "No," he whispered, "but I know why he died." His voice trembled. "And if you're here, that means they're coming for you too." Mariana stepped forward, her revolver still aimed at him. "Who?" she demanded. "Who's coming?" Montero swallowed hard, his gaze flickering toward the door as if expecting it to burst open at any second. His voice was barely more than a whisper when he spoke. "Rogerio's executioners," he exhaled shakily. "They know I talked to Alvaro." His eyes met Gabriel's, dark and hollow with fear. "And they won't let me live long enough to talk to you." Gabriel's stomach tightened. They weren't just late, they had walked straight into the storm. Gabriel's jaw clenched as Montero's words settled in the air like a slow-burning fuse. "They won't let me live long enough to talk to you." The doctor wasn't lying. His entire body was trembling, his eyes darting toward every dark corner as if expecting death to emerge at any moment. Gabriel had seen fear before. Real fear, the kind that settled into a man's bones when he knew he was already dead. Montero had accepted his fate. The only question now was whether Gabriel and Mariana were willing to accept theirs. Mariana took a step closer, her voice sharp but controlled. "If you know why Alvaro was killed, then you know what he was looking for," she said. "The ledger. Where is it?" Montero swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I don't know," he rasped. "Alvaro never found it." He exhaled shakily, but he got close, too close. His fingers curled against the floor, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. "The ledger isn't just numbers. It isn't just a list of names." His voice dropped lower. "It's a death sentence for anyone who touches it." Gabriel exchanged a glance with Mariana, tension tightening the air between them. They already knew the ledger was dangerous, but if Montero was this terrified, it meant there was something they were still missing. "What do you mean?" Gabriel pressed, his voice low. "What did Alvaro find before he died?" Montero's eyes darted toward the door again, his paranoia deepening. "He told me something the night before he was killed," he whispered. "That Rogerio wasn't the only one protecting the ledger." His fingers twitched. "There's someone else, someone bigger." Alvaro figured it out, but before he could tell me the name, he let out a shuddering breath. They silenced him. Gabriel's muscles tensed. If Alvaro had uncovered another layer to this conspiracy, it meant they weren't just up against Rogerio anymore. There was another player in this game, one they hadn't even seen yet. "Who?" Mariana demanded. "Who else is involved?" Montero opened his mouth to answer, but then the sound of shattering glass exploded through the room. A bullet tore through the office window, embedding itself into the wooden wall inches from Montero's head. He let out a strangled cry, throwing himself to the floor as Gabriel spun, his gun raised. Another shot rang out, punching through the desk. The executioners weren't coming, they were already here. The air exploded with the sharp crack of gunfire, shards of glass raining over Montero as he curled into himself, shielding his head. Gabriel reacted instantly, grabbing Mariana's wrist and yanking her down as another bullet whizzed past them, splintering the wooden filing cabinet behind them. The shots were precise, controlled. Whoever was outside wasn't just spraying bullets blindly. They were trained, executioners, just like Montero had warned. Gabriel didn't wait for another round to come flying. He reached for the overturned desk, flipping it on its side and pulling Mariana down behind it. The wood groaned under the impact of another shot, dust and splinters flying through the air. "They're pinning us in," he muttered, eyes flicking toward the broken window. The darkness outside swallowed the shooters whole. No clear figures, no outlines, just the cold certainty that death was waiting just beyond the walls. Mariana checked her revolver, her breath steady despite the chaos. "We're sitting ducks in here," she said, voice tight. "One of us needs to draw their fire, while the other gets Montero out." Gabriel glanced at the doctor, who was still frozen on the floor, his hands over his head like a man already waiting for the inevitable. Useless. Gabriel's mind raced. The hallway was their only cover, but if they made a break for it without knowing how many shooters were outside, they'd be cut down before they reached the back exit. Then a thought struck him. He reached into his jacket, fingers wrapping around the cold metal of the pistol he had taken from one of Rogerio's men back at the docks. He pulled it free, weighing it in his palm. "I can make them think we have more firepower," he said. "If I fire from one side of the room, they'll think we're splitting up. It might give you enough time to get Montero out the back." Mariana hesitated for half a second before nodding. "We don't have another option." She turned to Montero, grabbing his collar roughly. "Get up," she hissed, "unless you want to die in a pool of your own blood." The doctor's eyes were wide, his hands trembling, but he obeyed, stumbling to his feet. Gabriel shifted slightly, pressing his back against the overturned desk. "On my signal," he muttered. He took a deep breath, then pivoted, firing 2 quick shots through the window. The moment the bullets left the barrel, a fresh round of gunfire erupted from outside, hammering the spot where he had been just a second ago. "Go!" Gabriel barked. Mariana grabbed Montero's arm and bolted toward the back exit. Gabriel fired again, shifting positions to keep the shooters guessing. More glass shattered, more bullets ripped through the air, but he didn't stop moving. He just needed to buy them time. A single thought burned in his mind as he reloaded. Who the hell had sent them? And more importantly, how long before they sent more? Gabriel barely had time to reload before another round of gunfire shredded through the office, tearing through the walls like paper. The air reeked of gunpowder and splintered wood, the chaos pressing in from all sides. His mind worked fast. Too many shots, too much precision. At least 3 shooters, maybe more. They weren't just trying to kill them. They were boxing them in, cutting off every exit until there was nowhere left to run. Mariana and Montero were almost to the back door, their footsteps urgent against the creaking floorboards. Gabriel could hear Montero's ragged breaths, the panic slowing him down, but Mariana's grip on his arm was firm, dragging him forward. Gabriel fired again, aiming low, sending one of the gunmen stumbling backward outside. He didn't wait to see if the hit landed. There was no time. He ducked, moving fast toward the hallway as another volley of bullets tore through the window behind him. They were closing in. "Keep moving!" he shouted, catching up just as Mariana kicked open the back exit. Cold night air flooded in, thick with the scent of damp asphalt and burning adrenaline. The alley stretched out ahead of them, empty but exposed. No cover. If the gunmen caught sight of them before they reached the other side, it was over. Gabriel's mind raced. "We need a diversion," he muttered, scanning the surroundings. His eyes landed on an old gas canister near the dumpster. "Get him across," he told Mariana, already moving toward it. She didn't argue. With one last sharp tug, she pulled Montero forward, forcing him into a sprint. Gabriel grabbed the canister, tipping it over just as he pulled the lighter from his pocket. His hands were steady despite the rush of adrenaline, his movements precise. The liquid spread fast, pooling across the alley's entrance, and with one flick of the lighter, the flames roared to life. The fire wasn't big, but it was enough, a wall of heat and smoke curling into the night. It wouldn't stop the shooters, but it would slow them down. "Go!" Gabriel barked, breaking into a run. The flames crackled behind him, the air thick with smoke as he caught up with Mariana and Montero. The doctor was barely keeping up, his breaths labored, his panic slowing his legs. "Move faster or you're dead," Gabriel snapped, gripping his arm and forcing him forward. He could hear shouts behind them now, the gunmen regrouping, but they had lost their clear shot. That was all they needed. The alley opened onto a side street, dimly lit, the few streetlights flickering weakly. Mariana scanned the road, her chest rising and falling fast. "There," she said, nodding toward an old van parked near the curb. "We take it." Gabriel didn't question it. He pulled open the door, climbed into the driver's seat, and hot-wired the ignition in seconds. The engine roared to life just as Mariana shoved Montero into the back. "Hold on," Gabriel muttered, slamming his foot onto the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement as the van lurched forward, speeding into the night. The executioners were behind them. The answers were ahead, and there was no turning back now.